Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're going to be talking about thesis sentences today. For those of you who aren't in the know, which you are because you're probably a freshman, you know that thesis sentences are the best part of any essay. Everybody loves to write them. No, it's not a good joke at all. Nobody likes writing them. They're difficult. They make people frustrated. And I see students struggle with thesis sentences a lot because of several reasons. And the biggest reason is just that it really restricts what you're doing after you've written it. I find that a lot of students write their thesis statement and they want to really commit to it all the way through their essay, even if it's not working. And so it gets bad to the point where I've had students who I've talked to about their ideas, trying to generate new ideas for them to work into their essays. And they've said, well, I can't talk about that because it's not in my thesis. And obviously my answer is, well, just change your thesis. But many students are really adverse to actually doing that, maybe because it's work to have to go back and do that, maybe because it feels like it's a failure to have to change your thesis. But there is a way to write a thesis sentence that doesn't, and I'm going to use sentence and statement interchangeably. If I say thesis sentence or if I say thesis statement, I mean the exact same thing. That said, a thesis can be more than one sentence, so just understand that. But anyway, when you're writing your thesis statement, you can most certainly craft it in a way that gets rid of that anxiety and also opens a lot of doors for you when you're writing and enhances what you've done, not only in your introductory paragraph, but for like the rest of your essay. In fact, some people might say that this is the one trick the higher education industry doesn't want you to know, so that you can fail and pay more tuition to take more semesters to make up for the classes you failed. But anyway, let's talk about it. So up right now, what we have is a sample essay. I've redacted some information. I haven't changed anything from this. It's an actual student sample that I have that we're going to look at. The only changes I've made to this document is just formatting it to be in proper MLA formatting. So double spaced, 12-point Times New Roman, if you want to learn about that. I do have a video about that for Word 365 for all of you students who are using that to write all of your essays. But outside of that, this is exactly how the essay was submitted. Now, the first thing that I want to look at is the prompt, which is to argue whether the ads you examine are indeed empowering women or are simply a new twist on advertising's tendency to objectify women's bodies. Now, the thesis statement that this student came up with is right here at the very bottom. Companies reinforce conventional beauty standards, reduce women to their bodies, and employ sexual undertones to sell products in ads today. And that's really what I want to talk about, is that right there. Because that is a thesis sentence that works, but it also follows the mold of what you probably have been taught in high school about writing papers, which is probably structured around the 5-paragraph essay. That sucks. I don't like it. I don't know anyone who likes it. It exists for a reason, but that's a whole other discussion. I think they should get away with it. Whatever. I'm done talking about it. But part of that 5-paragraph essay is that in your thesis, you want to have some kind of statement that alludes to the main points that you're going to talk about in your essay. In this case, we do have the 3 that we are going to talk about: reinforcing conventional beauty standards, reducing women to their bodies, and employing sexual undertones to sell products in ads. And that's all great. That's fantastic. I love it. I really do. I think those are good points to talk about. It works really well. This particular essay is well done. That's not the issue. But the issue that I have here is that the way that this thesis is presented, it's very limiting. Having a thesis like this where it just lists out ideas that you believe are relevant, that you plan on talking about in your body of paragraphs, is something that can hurt you in several ways. First of all, you now feel obligated to talk about all 3 of these things in your body paragraphs because it's in your thesis. Psychologically, there's a block that's telling you, I already said in my thesis I'm going to talk about these 3 things, therefore I must talk about these 3 things. But again, this is an open-ended question, so that's not the case. Even if that's your thesis, you can always change your thesis. You can always change the direction that you approach this issue from. But the fact of the matter is, when you've written this out, you're not going to be as likely to as you would if you had a broader thesis. So that's what my recommendation is. My primary recommendation is that when you're writing a thesis, make it more broad. And that requires a little bit more work up front because you want to make sure that each of the topics that you talk about are going to be able to be included within that broad spectrum. And I'm going to talk more about how that's valuable later, but for this particular example, we have 3 topics that we've listed in this thesis that are referring to the sexualization of women. So if I was going to take this and I was going to rewrite this thesis in a way that was going to be more beneficial to me as a writer and more beneficial to my grade and maybe even to my reader as well, I might change it in this way. This bit here that I've added. Even well-meaning companies compel women to purchase their products through the manipulation of those women's sense of their own sexuality. Women's sense of their own sexuality, and more specifically the manipulation of it, is like that's exactly what is talked about in this original thesis. That's all that it is. So I can convey what I'm going to talk about in the essay broadly, while still covering everything that I intend on speaking about. But now I have the benefit of, if I don't want to talk about reducing women to their bodies specifically, I can replace that with something else that still fits under that umbrella, and nothing is lost. My thesis isn't misrepresented by the body paragraphs, even if I do decide to make that change. And that's one of the real benefits to doing it this way, is that it gives you that freedom to play around with your ideas more, to actually spend a lot more time thinking and engaging with the topic more broadly and figuring out what it is that you want to say specifically, like you as a writer, what you want to say, rather than boxing yourself into whatever topics you came up with, that some of them might be arbitrary depending on how you brainstormed, how you came up with them, but there might be space to move in different directions that still comply with the instructions and that still have sources that you can use to support those. And that's always going to be better, to find things that you're more engaged with than to write about something that you're just doing for the sake of it, which is what specifying in your thesis can do. And if you look at this and break it down, it's really clear to see that, because the main idea here is the manipulation of women's bodies or their sense of sexuality. Conventional beauty standards or reinforcing those standards is a manipulation of sense of sexuality. Reducing women to their bodies, manipulation of sense of sexuality. Employing sexual undertones to sell products, manipulation of sense of sexuality. All of that makes sense within that umbrella. So I can replace those 2 sentences and I've still said the same thing. This is also particularly useful if you're the kind of person who tends to write and go on tangents, because now, as long as your tangents are compliant with this more general thesis statement, you don't have to worry about it being seen as off topic. Because what you do when you have a list of items you're going to talk about in your thesis is you condition your audience to be looking for those things. So if I go through the body paragraphs and I see that reducing women to their bodies isn't something that's really explored in its own paragraph, now I feel like I've been lied to. I feel like and it's not even an I feel thing, honestly. At that point, it's just technically your article, your paper isn't focused, because you're telling me that you're going to talk about that reduction, and if you haven't done it, then you don't have focus in your paper. Your body paragraphs aren't reflecting your thesis, and now the whole thing feels a little bit lopsided. But if you approach it more generally and you just give the framework of what you're going to discuss in that paper, then it doesn't matter what topic it is that you talk about, as long as that topic falls under this more general umbrella. Women's sense of their own sexuality. That lets you branch out. That lets you try different things if you need to. You can easily change. And that really does feed into this other idea of making sure that the topics that you're talking about in your paper all have some kind of correlation with each other. If they're correlated, then you're going to have a much better time convincing your audience that all of these are factors that feed into your conclusion. Not only that, but your thesis as a whole is going to feel more coherent if there is a very clear connection between each of those ideas. And then that also feeds into something else that students struggle with, which is their transitions. So I do have the rest of the body paragraphs here for this essay. I'm not going to go over them. You don't need to read them. It's not really important. We just need to look at these specific sentences. This is how the reinforcement of conventional beauty standards is used in ads to help promote and sell a product because it is supposed to be the majority's main appeal. The majority referring to the majority of women. Reducing women to their bodies is one strategy advertisements use that transition is harsh because there's no relationship that's established between the reinforcement of conventional beauty standards and reducing women to their bodies. This information is just there. And this would be fine if this was the first body paragraph, this part right here, the second body paragraph, this introduction to this paragraph. That would be fine as the first paragraph. But there's no transition here. So even though these ideas are connected and there's thematically, if by nothing else, there doesn't seem to be any connection within the framework of the paper. And that's something that is so easy to correct if you make sure that all of the points you want to talk about are connected. Now, I can go back and make a change to this, which you're going to see in a little bit. And I can change this from reducing women to their bodies is one strategy advertisements use to send a message that women are only what they look like. And I can replace it with something like this. Very easily. This highlights how the majority thought only reduces women to their bodies and allows companies to use those bodies to send a message that women are only what they look like. I don't need a comma there. This is drawing that connection because now I'm talking about how the conventional beauty standards and the reinforcement of it is feeding in to this ability of corporations to reduce women to their bodies. And even if it's just a really simple comparison, it helps not only with the flow, but to show that you've actually thought about the issue and to show that you have been very conscious in choosing what topics you wanted to talk about for the particular issue. So, in addition to making your introduction better and your thesis better, this is also something that can help you a practice. Because it's not just any old thing, it really is a practice that you have to kind of work on and think about. That can improve the way that you're able to transition between different ideas. Because so many students struggle with transitions as well, and this is something that can really help you to nail some of those hard transitions. You don't have to use first, second, thirdly, however, and whatever else to transition between different paragraphs. That's a completely different video, but as long as there is some fluid movement between each paragraph and you are bridging those ideas, that still works as a transition. And the first step to getting there is to make sure that you have this, that everything that you talk about, to make sure that everything you have is contained under some coherent umbrella. And the last point that I want to make here is that when you do this, when you present this information from more of a general perspective, the manipulation of those women's sense of sexuality, and then this is what the student had all on their own, the subtle objectification of women, you can use these as themes throughout. The ideas, the specific ideas that you cover in each of your paragraphs, you can refer to those through these themes. So, how do conventional beauty standards reflect the manipulation of women's sexuality? How does reducing women to their bodies do that? How does employing sexual undertones do that? How do those things do the same for objectifying women? Because if you can point all of those things out over the course of your essay, point out this main idea that you introduced in your thesis within each of your body paragraphs, then this primes you so well to be able to go to your conclusion and say something that is meaningful. And not meaningful like I need to restate my thesis meaningful like I just spent however many words exploring all these ideas, and now that I've done that, I can make an evocative statement about how all of these details are supporting this idea that I presented in my thesis. Because restating your thesis isn't needed. Your reader already knows your thesis. What they need to know in your conclusion is how exactly those body paragraphs are relevant to it. Why are they relevant? And what can they take away? What do you want them to take away from the information you've just shared with them? And that becomes so much easier when you have this point of reference, this general idea that you know from the start that you want to convey to your audience. So when you're writing a thesis, when you're writing an introduction, do your best not to fall into that pattern of just listing out the things you're going to talk about. Instead, think about what conclusion it is you want to make, or think about what theme it is that you really want to cover in a way that's evocative, in a way that's interesting, in a way that can grab your reader. And that's not to say that you necessarily need to have a hook, but you do need to have some sort of statement that is worthy of inquiry, and you need to be able to explore that statement in your body paragraphs and explore it through multiple perspectives so that by the time you get to your conclusion, you can have something to say about it that is revelatory to your audience. Until the next video, drink water, stay healthy, call your parents when you think about them, and tell your friends that you love them. I'll see you then.